Hello everyone, thanks very much for joining this Scanning the Horizon session, exploring the interconnectedness of global trends. I'm Vicky Tung, I am the Programme Manager for Futures and Innovation here at the Centre. And I'm really pleased to hand over to Wolfgang Jarmann, who's our Executive Director, just to say a few words of welcome and a bit of an introduction about the Centre. Wolfgang.
Sure, thanks Vicky. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay, thumbs up, wonderful. So I'm Wolfgang Jarmann, I'm the Executive Director of the International Civil Society Center. Very pleased to see so many people online already. Lots of familiar faces and quite a number of new people interested in our work. I would like to welcome everyone to this first part of our annual Scanning the Horizon gathering. It's the first part that in itself has 3 different parts, and we're going to continue some of the discussions we're having this week later on in September. As Vicky has said, we are expecting well over 100 participants, most of who would know the International Civil Society Center and might have heard about our work with futurists, strategists and foresighters that has started really more than 5 years ago. So I don't need to say much about the center itself, only that we are supported by over 20 of the largest international civil society organizations in the world, across sectors from human rights to environment, from service deliverers to social justice organizations. And indeed, we offer collaborative work around understanding big trends and how they determine the future of civil society. So over many years, this disrupt and innovate has been the slogan that described our work in this and with this community, meaning understanding and embracing disruption and also responding to it innovatively. And while a very big disruption has come upon us over the last 3 months, we are not limiting this meeting to the corona crisis only, but looking beyond and how trends, various trends, including global pandemics, are connected and how they reinforce each other. I would like to thank in advance everyone who's agreed to give input to the 3 sessions that we have this week, who has agreed to help facilitate and who's supporting our work. And of course, in particular, I want to thank Vicky Tong, who's organized this event, who's the mastermind behind this, as the program's managers for Innovation and Futures and the Center, and who's taking it back from me now. So handing it over back to you, Vicky.
Thanks, Wolfgang. So just very quickly on the Scanning the Horizon initiative, we are a cross-sector platform of trend scanners, foresighters and global strategists. As Wolfgang said, this is our 5th year. And we have 23 members, including many of the organisations that are from the previous slide, but also from national CSO platforms and the private sector. We're now using the slogan that we've been making megatrends more manageable since 2015. Last year, we looked at the rise of global China and the implications for our sector. So do go and check out that work. And this year, we felt it was more important than ever to look at the interconnectedness of trends. Just running through the agenda. So days 1 and 2 is really going to look at what we're calling the necessary but messy approach to looking at the interconnectedness of trends. So we will have sector strategists who will make the case for the why, so why this is necessary and why we need to get better at doing it. And then we will hear insights from foresighters from the business sector, from the civil society sector, from academia and from the public sector to help give us some ideas for how to make this process a bit less messy. And day 3, we will move into more action planning around collaborative working for the autumn meetings that Wolfgang mentioned. So today we will start with some scene setting by 3 of our sector strategists, and then we have a fireside chat with Arup, and then a presentation from Plan International, and then you will have the chance to discuss everything that you've heard and talk about your organisational experiences in some breakout sessions. We are now upwards of 70 people, so just a little bit that will help us manage you all and make sure we get through the agenda. Please use the chat box for questions and comments to the speakers. That will help me when I'm picking out what to ask them. Please edit your Zoom name to include your organisation. That makes it a bit easier for everyone to know during the breakout sessions. Please keep your microphones muted, and any issues that you have with the tech, please contact my colleague Ryan. So with that, I would like to start hearing from our sector strategists on why is this necessary. So I will first, we'll hear from the three speakers first and then do some Q&A and some comments. So first I'd like to invite Danny from Amnesty. If you could pop your camera on, please, Danny. And please tell us briefly why we need to engage more with these kind of approaches. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Danny Van Nucke. I'm the Deputy Director of Global Strategy and Impact at Amnesty. Thanks, Vicky, for the opportunity to address everybody, and we're very much looking forward to these 3 days. What I wanted to do is just to really share some reflections and thoughts that bring us back to last year as well, that bring us back to last year's theme, which, as Vicky said, was really focusing on China's growing influence in the world, and how, as an organization, that was, for us, that was quite an important moment to realize actually how foresight cannot be something that is limited to a certain area of work, but really needs to underpin all of our programmatic work and our expertise. The conference last year couldn't have come at a better time. You know, at Amnesty, we had just developed a project that was looking at China's role abroad in its protection and advancement of human rights. And we developed a project that for the first time was looking at foresight, not just in its development, but also in its implementation. So as we are trying to influence the decision makers and the key stakeholders, we were also trying to surface a collaborative analysis by anyone in the organization who was working on China to help us understand, do we have the right analysis? Do we have the right assumptions? Do we have the right information? So the sector guide that was developed last year through the Scanning the Horizon meeting was invaluable as being able to look outside of our own bubble of analysis. I encourage you all to have a look at the guide, at the sector guide, if you haven't had a chance to do that. But what's really been exciting for us has been the journey since last year's meeting. We've really been looking at how do we make sure that we replicate this model of working across all of our programs. So how do we make sure that we're not just delivering campaigns or delivering our strategies, but also generating foresight results and foresight analysis as we conduct our operations. We've been trying to think about how do we make sure that foresight is established not just as a practice of our staff, but also as a habit. How do we embed foresight habits in the way that all of our work is conducted? So we've been looking at a programmatic level, at an operational level, how do we make sure that we generate trends analysis and foresight? But at a higher level, we've tried to also make sure that these learnings and this foresight analysis contributes to the development of our global strategy. And we as an organization, we know many of you are looking at their global strategy in the next 10, 15 years. And we've really brought some of the learnings from the China Abroad work into our decision on what to focus on in the next 10, 15 years. So, you know, this has been the journey for us since really last year, looking at strengthening foresight at a programmatic level, but also making sure that that analysis is brought into the development of our global strategy. But we know that we cannot only look at one element to help shape the future. I think now more than ever, we see how it is different elements, different trends that will influence different and potential futures. So there are 3 reflections that really came from the meeting last year that we'd like to share with everybody in the conversations going forward. First of all is really reflecting on added value. And what became clear to us is, as we all come from our different perspectives, whether it's philanthropy, the corporate world, or civil society, creating a collaborative foresight analysis also helps us as organizations understand how we stand out from each other and how we add value to a crowded space in trying to, make the world a better place. And I think I encourage us all to think in those terms as we continue these conversations in the next 3 days. The second point is, how do we keep on top of an ever-changing analysis? And I think this was really interesting from last year's sector guide that we developed on China's growing influence. Already 1 year later, we see that so much has changed and that our analysis constantly needs to be kept up to date. So this is a challenge, I guess, and a provocation for us. How do we make sure that what we come up with now is something that we can keep going back to and making sure that it never goes out of date? And I know the way that we are approaching the meeting this year, doing a little bit now and a little bit in September, already allows us to make sure that that analysis is very much adaptive and constantly changing. And finally, making sure that really this collaboration continues beyond this space. That this doesn't remain a once in a year opportunity to connect. And I know Vicky and the service will make sure that that's possible going forward. So why do we need to look at the interconnectedness of trends? I mean, I think it's a question that answers itself. I think we're all thinking about the future today. The future is scary. The future is unclear. Let alone because of this pandemic. But we're seeing that it's not just foresight practitioners that are asking themselves these questions, it's everybody is really thinking about the future. What we've noticed in our organization is that, really the pandemic and this crisis has definitely pivoted people to think about the future, but it often happens based on a short-term view of the world. A lot of decisions are taken based on what we see now and what we think on the basis of what we see now, the future will be. And we've been trying as an organization to take a step back and think about what are the long-term impacts of the pandemic that may not be clear today, and how can we take better decisions today to help us, develop stronger strategies, stronger programs. So really, this is, again, this conference and this theme couldn't have come at a better time to help us as an organization, as we're developing our global strategy, help us develop that and help us strengthen our programs. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And again, really looking forward to hearing from others and being stronger from everyone's analysis and everybody's point of view.
Great, thanks Danny, and thanks for making the continuity from last year. It's great to hear those kind of insights as well. Doris, could I invite you to speak next, please, and pop your camera on?
Sure, I hope you can see and you can hear me. It's a
Thank
bit
you,
scary
yes.
to be referred to as a sector strategist. I'll do my best. And actually building on some of what Danny said and picking up on it. So at Oxfam, I work at Oxfam International. We have just gone through an 18-month strategy process that was based on transformative scenario thinking. And we actually try to involve staff from across the Confederation in developing those scenarios, so quite locally rooted as an approach. Our global boards have approved our new 10-year strategic framework at the end of March, acknowledging the moment that we're in, the world, the sector Oxfam, and therefore asking us to defer the external launch and also to defer a process of more near-term horizon planning. But we have agreement around 4 areas of transformative system change, and very much it's all built around the idea of interconnectedness and how the connectedness of those 4 systems drives multiple forms of inequality that then again, in the way how they interconnect, perpetuate poverty and injustice. So for those of you who know Oxfam as a global confederation, it's a global network complex global network, and some would probably say it's extraordinary complex. And that complexity brings challenges, but it also brings a lot of positive things in the way of diversity of experience, diversity of the contexts that we're working in, and increasingly also diversity of voice within the organization. So for Oxfam, even in a strategic planning context, it's quite tempting to think that the diversity that we have within the organization is maybe good enough, and that there is even little need to look outside and elsewhere. But in the strategy process, we took a very conscious decision to go the transformative scenarios approach, to actually force a reflection that is from the outside in and not from the inside out. As a sector, I think, if you don't mind me saying it, and I'm saying it with all respect to everyone in this call and way beyond, but we've been talking about disruption, and we've been talking about the need for transform for quite a number of years, but often we're actually largely talking to ourselves about that. So it's the sector discussing how the sector thinks the sector should transform. And I think within Oxfam, and also following the Haiti moment, the safeguarding crisis, we've come to appreciate more and more that that's no longer good enough. So that inner world, which is, VUCA as we know it, so it is, in the old sense of the acronym, volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. But that, there's also the opportunity, and that idea doesn't come from me. I stole it from someone else who said it recently, and I just can't remember who, but VUCA actually also standing for vision, for understanding, for clarity, and for agility. So this is no longer the time, as we all know, for one size fits all. And it's really the time where we need to break our mental models, whether that is about the old development paradigms, whether that is our definition of what is and what isn't knowledge, and maybe even how we interpret feminism and feminist approaches. So how do we do that as a sector, and with all the baggage and all the opportunity that we bring to that, and what does that mean in terms of why should we engage more with complex potential futures? I think for us it really relates to the value add, as Danny said, and the how can we be better in being relevant over time and over space, and like in the eyes of the beholder, so in the eyes of those we work with and for. So for our value proposition to be relevant in a VUCA world, in both of the sense of the acronym, if we want to effectively be a convener or a boundary spanner, which is a word that has been suggested to us, that seems to be a role that is of added value to others. That's at least what others have told us in our strategy process, that should be part of the offer that we make. And we believe we can bring a unique helicopter perspective to that as Oxfam, but also as a sector. We can bring global footprint, we can bring global access, but nevertheless, to be effective in being a convener or being a boundary spanner, we need to think ahead differently, and we need to become better at imagining those plausible futures, so that we can also then build the competencies that would help us to adjust fast, so that we can help others adjust, and again bring us into that space of vision and understanding and clarity, and or agility. So we think that will actually require quite a different and new set of skills. We'll have to unlearn some of our INGO and Oxfam past, so that we can be better in that future space. But we do think that if we can engage better with potential futures, then our value proposition to those we work with and work for will be more relevant, and as such then more impactful and more sustainable. Thanks.
Lovely, thanks Doris. And on your theme of breaking mental models and challenging assumptions, I think Samantha's going to share some of Mercy Corps' experience on this. So Samantha, go ahead please.
Great, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Great. So hi, I'm Samantha Albury. I'm the strategy and learning advisor here at Mercy Corps. And today I actually, as I was trying to think about why we need to engage with more complex program or potential futures, one particular event just kept reoccurring in my head. And I decided to kind of drill down even further. So Danny kind of started at the sector level, Doris brought it to an organizational. I'm going to bring it down almost to country level and then zoom that back out. So I'm going to share a story of a personal experience that I've had engaging with scenario planning and thinking. And how we were able to use scenario planning to bust through a pervasive narrative in a particular country and open the minds of the team to more, to deeper levels of strategic thinking. So during one of my earlier country visits in this capacity that I'm in, I had the pleasure of working with a country director named Tate. Who was equally interested in developing a strategy as he was in developing the strategic thinking capabilities of his team. And because of this dual purpose, we were able to take a slightly different approach towards our strategic planning process than we typically would. And we were able to explore and play in ways that were not always custom. I'm not always used to having that amount of time with our country teams. So as we were preparing for our strategy workshop, Tate and I were discussing kind of the strengths, the weaknesses of the team. We were talking about kind of the context in Timor-Leste. And he repeatedly was talking about the impact of oil on the economy in Timor-Leste. They had a lot of oil, but they were running out, and they had a very specific date at which it was going to run out, which I was always kind of baffled by. How could you know exactly when it's going to run out? And then wait a second, the reserves were actually much deeper, and they realized that there was more oil, and would Timor-Leste have access to this? And then another question about oil, and then another question about oil. And then meanwhile, Tate was complaining to me that his team could not see past oil as every time that they were engaging in strategy conversations. And so what I realized as he was doing this was that Tate himself was beholden to the narrative around potential importance of a future state, one potential future state, which was highly unknown, actually, even though all of the details made it seem that it was highly unknown what this future state might be. So what was I supposed to do with this? I chatted with Tate, and I kind of mentioned the fact that he himself seems beholden to this narrative. And we decided we needed to take oil off the table if we were going to be able to have a successful strategic conversation. But you can't just do that. You can't just not talk about something because you don't want to. But how could we meaningfully address oil without it completely dominating the entirety of the conversation? So what we decided to do is we decided to run a scenario planning exercise. And on one axis, we had oil. We had a lot of oil, less oil. And on the other axis, we were talking about growth, the different types of growth that Timor-Leste could be experiencing. And through the course of this exercise, it was almost as though I saw light bulbs going off in team members. It was kind of one by one. It was this magical experience where people were starting to recognize that the future had the 4 future scenarios had elements of today embedded within them. And that by looking at the different scenarios, they were able to see different possibilities. For the first time ever, this team actually started talking about the role that governance plays in the use of assets that are available to them. So at the end of this particular session, we kind of began some of the more traditional parts of a strategy development process, visioning and setting strategic objectives. And while the people who were in the room were the exact same people, it was like I was working with a different team, a completely different team. Oil seldom came up as a constraint or as an asset. And Tate was shocked and just amazed at the level of insight and observations that the team was able to make. He'd never seen this before because their thinking had always felt so stuck to him. And this was able to happen in just a very short exercise of working with scenario planning. So why is that relevant? Why is that relevant to what we're going into today? You know, the reason I'm telling this story is it wasn't just the team in Timor-Leste who had light bulbs going off through the course of this exercise. It taught me as well kind of the way that pervasive narratives can almost trap us into ways of thinking that prohibit us from seeing potential possibilities. It happens to us all the time. It's likely happening to us now. As the coronavirus showed up, the future scenarios, everything became questionable and no one knew anything what was going to happen. And only 2 or 3 months in, you can start seeing that certain narratives are taking hold. So it's interesting to me that at the time that you're trying to think about futures, everyone says it's impossible to predict the future. And yet we hold on to very specific narratives about the future that are just one potential scenario. And we often, in holding on to these narratives, we often miss the signals that are directly in front of us that might point the way towards potential future scenarios that we can either take advantage of to help mold the future that we'd like to see, or at the very least prepare for that future. So using that example, it's incredible to me to this day to see how much a team can grow and how critical using scenario planning, other forms of future, kind of engaging with complex futures, can really help both debunk prevalent narratives, opening our mind, kind of disrupting the way that we think in order to be able to engage and think strategically. So with that, that's one of the reasons I've been just very excited to be able to engage in these conversations. I'm excited to be able to engage in the intersectionality of the trends that we're planning to be talking about over the course of the next few days and then months. So with that, just want to say thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the next few days.
Thanks very much, Samantha. And I think that leads very nicely into what we're going to be talking about with Gerian in a few minutes about scenarios and opening up new conversations. I do just want to take a moment to invite any comments or questions to these guys in their chat before we move on. You will get the chance to interact with them in your breakout sessions later as well. They're each going to be taking a group. But if there are any immediate insights or questions, please do pop them in the chat now. Okay, I can't see anyone typing, so we can come back towards this at the end. So from another office somewhere in Berlin, it gives me great pleasure to invite Gerian Ertz to join me for this next session. Gerian is leader of Foresight to Europe at Arup. He's a highly experienced corporate foresight practitioner and lecturer and author on corporate foresight and innovation management. Before joining Arup 5 years ago, Gerian worked at Debunk, the Foresight company, and in Volkswagen's research group, and lectured at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And Gerian has been part of a team at Arup that developed these 4 plausible scenarios for 2050, which we got very excited about when we read as a way of looking at things intersectionally. So looking at planetary health and societal conditions. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to talk to Gerian about this and foresighting processes more broadly. So thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting. It's a great pleasure.
So just a kind of big picture level, Arup Arup works on the built environment and has social values and sustainability very strongly as part of its focus. Could you talk quickly about why Foresight is important to Arup and the role that you and your Foresight colleagues play for the company, and also your commitment to sharing this kind of analysis with more broadly with wider stakeholders?
Yes, I'm happy to do that, Vicky. The vision in VUCA, which has been stressed by Doris, I think is one of the crucial elements. We think that we need to lead the way, to guide the way, to challenge things, and having a clear vision or setting a vision and sharing a vision, discussing a vision with all your stakeholders, internally and externally, is a good means to get moving. To get starting to change things and to have serious discussions about how to do it. And I think the main reason why we do foresight and why we do scenarios with that particular perspective and angle is that we are in a very complex sector, the architecture, engineering, construction business, and the industry as such is very complex, and it has a high responsibility. Like 40% of the emissions and 40% of the energy use roughly can be attributed to our sector. Yeah? We're part of that industry. So having a vision and values, of course, and to discuss where you want to go and where you want to lead and take others along is to us not just meaningful, it's existential. You know, it's a make or break type of sector. We cannot urbanize Africa in the same way and based on the model that we have for the Northern Hemisphere. It will simply not work out in terms of material use, in terms of its unsustainability. So the vision and doing scenarios, understanding complex change and having others sign up for that vision and be part of the conversation, like where do we want to go and how do we get there, to us is the motivation, and it's the reason, I think, why we exist as Foresight in Arup.
Thanks. And so you're also a global organisation, and I know these scenarios were developed with colleagues, with inputs from colleagues around the world and lots of different disciplines as well. So in terms of managing this messiness that we've been talking about, how do you do that? How do you manage the process and boil down all of this rich diversity and detail of insights into these kind of concise but yet evocative summary scenarios?
It's a mixture of, you know, having someone steering the course and being in charge and organizing, but basically backing it up and making it happen. And I know that Chris Lübgemann is on the call. He joined as our global Foresight leader, that the person who started Foresight in Arup as a distinct activity. You need to have that backup by saying, look, we want to do it. And then, you know, steering and holding course and getting it done, while at the same time allowing all those diverse voices and inputs across disciplines, across backgrounds, across geographies, in particular across geographies and across gender and everything to get the richness and the input that somehow, at least as much as you can, reflects the diversity of the potential futures out there and the current situation. It is a heterogeneous, diverse thing which is out there, and it's likely that it will be in the future. And you need to capture and allow those diverging, dissecting voices into the process and really soak that in, enable that, encourage it to think the unthinkable. So Samantha's example with the oil was great. You need to allow and encourage this strange, weird, unthinkable thinking as part of the process, which you do best by having not just the usual suspects gathering around the table, but to talk to a variety of people in the organization without, you know, overcomplicating and without having too much, you know, discussions about how to do it, but, you know, bring together good people and have them exchange openly and manage the process as best as you can. And that's, the facilitation and the process is very important to come to a good result.
Yeah, I know when we discussed this before, you said that actually there is a real magic to embracing the messiness of those conversations, but actually you really do need to bring people to trust the whole process to enable them to feel safe having those conversations. So my next question is around your choice of a 2050 timeframe. So obviously with the 2030 SDGs, you did use those as one parameter to guide the scenarios and also as a kind of milestone towards 2050. You've even done 4 sets of reporting against the final indicators for 2030 in the different scenarios. Why did you decide to go for this longer timeframe?
Because it's an extreme long cycle that our industry runs on, and as long as you can, I think, choose a time horizon which is far away or in the distant mid of the century is the best way for scenarios. You need to tackle wicked or complex issues. That was stressed also in the conversations before. A complex subject, because if it's easy, you don't need to use scenarios. You can, do your extrapolations or do some predictions and can work around. But if it's complex and it's related and complex issues that are interconnected, scenarios are a good way of tackling this. And the same is for the long view, for the long perspective, the long time horizon. So 2050, it's 40 years. Yeah, that's 1.5 generation basically. But with respect to the architecture, engineering, construction industry and the change that's happening out there, the concrete, the infrastructures, the buildings, the energy systems, the cities as such, they are there for 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, and that's good. That they are running on a different, time scale and cycle in our individual lives and the news. Yeah, so especially with respect to the built environment, our second nature, that we need to do things, it is always a good choice to look at least to 2050. I once did scenarios for forestry on a global level, and there you can easily talk about the 2100 time frame, because they are even, the natural cycles are even longer than the built environment artificial ones. So always tailor the horizon that you're dealing with to the subject. Yeah? And with the built environment, we by nature run or have to look at the longer time horizon than, let's say, consumer goods.
I think that's really interesting, and for our sector, the way we kind of use the SDG 2030 framework is kind of almost where we put our thinking, but actually that's very quickly coming upon us. So again, back to the messiness, you plotted 20 critical factors within these scenarios, each of which had multiple potential trajectories. You incorporated signals from the present, and you also looked at other things like media inspirations. So there's a lot there of potential material to work with. How do you actually go through the process of deciding what to include and clustering and combining for different scenarios?
Yeah, again, it's a mixture of a really superstructured process and a tool that we use, but we just use the tool for doing the final scenarios and cross-combining all the elements in the system, because doing that exceeds the human calculating power of the brain. But in the beginning, or as important as using a tool or relying a tool and the structured process, is to look at the context and the outside world from the outside in perspective continuously. So it is really about trying to the best of your organization's capability to make sense of what is going on around you, because there is, as you kind of indicate, there's always so much going on that you need to understand what is relevant and what is not relevant, coming from your particular perspective and the relevant system or the frame that you're operating in. And with a broad range of activities and values and a general interest in the future and the world and shaping a better world, you look at a lot of things, because the built environment and our everyday lives, the transportation systems, everything is relevant to a lot of people all across the world. So a lot of influencing factors and trends and signals that you need to look at and filter the noise out from the things that could become relevant or could be meaningful to your organization and to your business. So we have a constant exchange and the capability of people looking outside in, trying to understand and make sense of what they're seeing, reporting that back, analyzing it, making sense of all that data to have the information at hand. But then it comes down to deciding, okay, we do a scenario or we do a trend analysis, and it is for a particular part of the world out there. In the case of the scenarios we are looking, it was about the whole of the world. It was like a really long time horizon and a very broad scope, as you can see from the two axes. And the reason for that and why we did it was that we didn't want to do, or I in particular, didn't want to do scenarios in the first place. We were looking for a vision. We were looking for a vision based on the question that Chris asked us: can we imagine what 2050 would look like if the majority or all of the sustainable development goals would have been achieved, would have been realized? And you easily figure that this is a hard thing to imagine, because we are so wrapped up, as Samantha put it, in a kind of in a framed, pre-perceived, mostly more dystopian or negatively kind of shadowed view on things, because there's a lot of things going on which are not good and not okay and not nice, that it is hard to imagine, okay, what actually would our world and subsystems of our society and world look like if this all realizes? We thought we need that vision to take our stakeholders, ourselves as an organization, along to be even more ambitious in the projects and in the aims, to say we want to achieve that. We want to, backcast from that future what we need to do right now to get there. So it wasn't planned to be a scenario process, but Chris insisted on doing a scenario process because it is a structured process. It's a good process. And you, looking back, now to the process and the outcome, to the 4 scenarios, it makes complete sense to not just have that one vision, the nice one, the great one, the one that we want to work towards to, but to have the alternative futures lined out as well in a plausible and consistent way. So the answer to your question, Vicky, is we try to allow for, the messiness and diversity. We also need the guidance, but everything we do is based also on a continuous, exchange and the soaking in and the trying to make sense and understand what is actually happening around us and what this change means and how we can not just cope with it or deal with it, but how we can move little by little our industry, ourselves as an organization towards a better future.
Great. So I've got a couple more questions and then we'll have a quick poll on the scenarios themselves. I think Samantha captured it really nicely, the power of narrative, but also a good scenario is a good story as well. And I think that's something, personally, I feel that that's something that is really strong in your paper, the kind of summary scenarios with the technical aspects. You really able to bring that down to a kind of evocative story of a daily commute for someone living in those future worlds, and also like it imagines the historical events that they will have lived through in the past as well in 2050. How do you make these kind of decisions to move from the technical to these kind of evocative stories, and again decide on what these kind of events in the past that are actually our future are?
Yeah, we know, we are very aware of the power of the narrative and of storytelling, and a good scenario tells a convincing story. The science fiction writer Hugo Gernsback in the 1920s once coined this term of the willing suspension of disbelief. And what you need to achieve in a scenario is that willing suspension of disbelief. People need to actually be able to a certain extent, put themselves in the shoes of, living in that scenario. That's the reality I'm facing, and get a sense of what this would feel like, smell like, and how they would act like, and in this future world. So we are aware of that, and again, I'm not the the best person to ask about that type of storytelling with personas and everything, because I used to work in an environment and do scenarios merely for strategic planning, for real tough decision making based on scenarios, which is better than to base it on forecast or extrapolation. So, but then the narratives and the personas were not the most important part, to convince your stakeholders, decision makers. But if you're talking to a broader and bigger audience, I think it's a very good thing to think about, fake news, fake products, not fake news in the sense that we discuss it right now, but to design artifacts which aren't existing today, to create engaging formats, which could be videos, products that are not existing yet, advertisements for products that you can't buy yet. And the personas and the storytelling is one means of doing that, to get a more emotional and a more immersive kind of interaction of people with the worlds that you have been designing for them. And it's good to hear that this worked out, that you can imagine the day-to-day or the everyday life of a person to a certain extent, but by reading it in those 4 scenarios. And that's what we want to do. So we bring in people who are better in storytelling and in narrations than us. In that case, a copywriter, which we worked with to really get this right, because this to a certain extent exceeds the capabilities, not of the entire team, but of the people working on that particular scenario project, including Chris, me, and Jonelle.
Great. And I know that these were kind of pre-COVID-19 scenarios. If you've already developed scenarios, but then there are these kind of high impact, high uncertainty events, where do you go from there, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the scenarios now, and I really liked them. I was very skeptical and critical while we were doing them, so the usual way. But if you look at the greentocracy scenario, you could exchange the green for virus or virotocracy, because the greentocracy scenario is the one which simply, basically, bottom line tells that we value to safeguard nature and the environment and put it first, and we make certain sacrifices, or we do things, and we are more sufficient and not just efficient in our resource use and so forth, which puts constraints on our way of living and consumptions. So we are dominated by nature and the environment in the greentocracy scenario. If you look at what we see right now, we are in a world where virologists inform politics and inform decision making. So there is natural sciences, medicine, hygiene, much more important than it used to be. And I was surprised that you could use the greentocracy scenario and use 80% of the content and just exchange it with the virotocracy, and you get a meaningful scenario. But in general, it is always for scenarios great to have a wild card or a disruption happening, because you could stress test your scenario against this wild card or against this stressor, which is just which has just occurred. And if it holds, and if you see, oh well, it either will swing back to that scenario 1, 2, or 3, or we need to adjust a little. But in the end, the signals that we need to look at and the core narrative is right. It is always, it's a lucky moment actually to see something of that scale, which is terrible, yeah, but to see it happening and then confront it with your own thinking and ask yourself, okay, what difference does it make? And if you still have a lot of things that you think are either right and are likely to happen or still potentially happening in the future, or from a normative perspective, it doesn't change a thing. It reinforces the vision that you have in that positive, normative, like more vision-driven end of the scenarios. It's exactly where we need to go, and it's exactly what we need to remember and what we need to, get back discussing once we are over the worst of this pandemic, in the visionary and in the ambitious, positive scenario that we have been outlining. So as a foresight expert or someone in that domain, it is always super interesting to see things like that happening, despite all the pain and the misery that is coming along with that.
Great, thanks very much. So I'd just like to take a break at this point. Would like to run a quick poll for those of you who've read the scenarios. Ryan, can you run the poll, please? And the question is, which one of the 4 scenarios made you feel the most uncomfortable? We'll come back to these conversations within ARUP. I would also just like to stop and see if there's not a huge amount of comments or questions in the chat, so please feel free to add. But Doris, you've made an interesting point about your scenarios at Oxfam, so I'd like to invite you back in to just share that verbally if you'd like to come back.
Now or after the poll?
Yeah, do it now during the poll while people are voting.
No, so in our process, so first we took a decision to run a transformative scenario process, not just a scenario process, and then we did get support in our case from RIOS partners in South Africa, and RIOS is, arguably one of the leaders in the field, and yet I think we also stretched their imagination and their patience and their boundaries in terms of how we wanted to do it, because we did not want to just bring a global group of people from across the organization together in a room and then tell them to workshop it out, and then we've got our global scenarios. But we said one of the principles for our process was this idea of locally rooted, which for us meant that we wanted to engage as many as the 10,000 staff, which we just use always as a ballpark figure that Oxfam has globally. So it wouldn't have been possible time-wise and resource-wise to invite teams from across Oxfam to all develop full-blown scenarios. So we developed something that we then ended up calling vignettes, which half of us couldn't pronounce properly, and and even those who could pronounce it wouldn't have been able to explain it well. But it was basically just a very short story about the future, so like something you could do in a 2-hour or half-day workshop. And then we did invite teams from across Oxfam, different regions, different functions, sometimes cross-functional, to come together and just do that. And it was great in terms of building ownership of the process. It was actually sometimes really a lot of fun. And then, it meant that we got 250 plus of these stories. And there's 1 or 2 colleagues in the core that were also part of the process. And we got them all entered into an ideation platform, but still then had indeed to do a lot of manual work. But then the strategy team that we had, which was again a team from across the organization, different functions, different viewpoints, different experiences, came together in a 4 or 5 day workshop, and literally we had all the stories up on the wall. We had done some pre-analysis in terms of clustering of where are similar themes emerging, and the beauty of the process is that you will see similar themes emerging, whether it is from the Solomon Islands to France to somewhere else. And then we just, then we workshopped it and saw what's emerging. Is there something emerging that looks like a global, potential future? And we initially had 4 emerging, and then in a second step we realized that we had missed one aspect, and we added a 5th one, and then we tried to tell those stories, and that then became one of the key inputs in the process as we went forward. So and then once we had the scenarios, the next step was also to then reflect. So we were very strict. You're not allowed to talk about Oxfam while you're discussing the the scenarios, and we had a beautiful picture that Rios, I think, had brought to us of, you know, this picture of a rhino and the rhino painting a picture. But the rhino will always look at the world, and the picture that it draws, you will always see the horn, because, you know, it can't actually look at the world, you know, it always, its own horn is in the way. So all the pictures might look different, but there's always the horn of the rhino in it. So we said there's no talking about Oxfam in the developing scenarios or short stories about the future. But then once we had the scenarios, we again went back to all of Oxfam to say, okay, now let's think about what could be the implications for Oxfam from where you are sitting in the organization, from your perspective for your future work in your context with the resources that you may have, but also on behalf of the global. And then together with lots of other inputs, you know, including meta-analysis, where we drew on some of the work from Oxfam Great Britain, and Irene is on the call here. We managed to somehow then have, I think, seven themes maybe emerging that we then took into our global strategy forum, as we called it, which was a whole other thing. I'm not going to bore you with that now, but so it was messy, but it was great in building ownership. It certainly, you know, forced the outside-in perspective, and it did turn out to be useful right to the point of approval, because we were just lucky that one of the scenarios mentioned pandemics, and then we just used that a bit to then also, you know, explore with the board of like, are we at risk of approving a framework that's no longer relevant because of COVID? Or even if the framework doesn't speak about pandemics, but, you know, the things that it identifies in a 10-year, you know, horizon, are they actually maybe more relevant than ever? And thankfully, the board landed on that conclusion.
Okay, thanks, Doris. So I think we can go to the results of the poll now. Ryan, can you publish them, please? We'll see which one made people the most uncomfortable. There are a couple of questions, but I'd just like to kind of invite a couple of thoughts from Chris, previously from Arup, who was involved in this process, and then just round up the final couple of questions with Garion.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Hi, Garion. Great introduction. I just want to add a couple of points to clarify. You know, at Arup, we had the 3 time frames we always thought about: the now, the new, and the next. And the now was, can you hear me okay? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Okay. The now is obviously operational issues. The new are 3 to 5 years away, and the next was 20 plus. And it's very important when we're doing the scenarios to remember what the intent is. Because as Garion said, sometimes you do scenarios for the now, just trying to deal with various logistical issues. So I think the intent becomes really critical. The second is, we all are prejudiced. You know, we like to think we're not, but we are. It's just based on our life experiences. So we all have cognitive dissonance and prejudice. And therefore, as Garion was describing, it was really critical for us to bring together, consciously craft groups who were not necessarily comfortable with each other, and therefore, and to work through the different axes and to work through the different issues. As again, as Garion said, he didn't really want to do this at the beginning, but I knew he was absolutely the right person to take on a leadership role in it, and a lot maybe because of his skepticism. And I think that was also important, is to embrace your prejudice and work with it. Then the last one, the ownership issue, was really critical, and it's a beautiful story about how you were able to create the vignettes and to grab the hearts and minds of individuals. So you're getting over the, well, that's a nice story, but that has nothing to do with me. And that's really critical with the scenarios and the storytelling, is how you break through that barrier. It's like, oh, that's a really cool scenario, nice, but that's nothing to do with me. And that's probably, to me, the hardest thing with all the scenarios, is how to get through that. And we worked very hard on that. And I think we were somewhat successful, but not always. And then the very, very last thing I'll say is the reason we did this, really, when we go back to it, is all 3 of the scenarios which were negative were easy, perceived negative, were easy for all of us to imagine. And the hardest thing we couldn't figure out was how to help our clients and society move into the double positive. And so this was what we really, this was really the genesis for us. How do we get to the regenerative world? And we were trying so desperately to figure this out. And one of the things that we said it would never happen without a crisis. We couldn't imagine it. And so hopefully we're not going to waste this crisis that we're in right now to get up there. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we can see that Extinction Express is overwhelmingly the one which makes people the most uncomfortable. So coming back to you, Gary, and just to round up, which scenarios made your Arab colleagues the most uncomfortable, and what are the new kinds of conversations that these kind of scenarios have generated internally, and the new ideas they've opened up?
It's a disappointing answer, I guess, because we didn't yet have the time to really have those conversations based on the scenarios. They were issued were a little before Christmas. Yeah, and then, as usual, we were busy doing other things, and we got workshops and all those strategic conversations planned for this spring and summer in the region and in the other global regions, and that didn't happen for now. They will happen, and then we're going to learn more which of the scenarios resonated the most. But we use them and will use them for those conversations about the future of our own organization, for the strategizing. And I love the analogy or the metaphor of the rhino and the horn, because we stay completely out as an organization in those contextual scenarios, but then use them to hopefully make informed decisions based on structured discussions about which word we want to have. Personally, I know, and I from conversations I had, is that the upper left one, the greentocracy one, is a difficult one. It was a difficult one for us to figure out over the course of the process, and because it sketches a world where the planetary health improves, but the societal wealth doesn't improve that much or declines. This is hard to imagine for a lot of people, and to label it like that in an organization that is, deeply based and rooted in values and in sustainability wasn't easy. So Chris and me also had conversations about, in the end, we said, no, let's keep it like that, because one of the main reasons to do scenarios is to challenge the mindset and to challenge preconceived things and biases, and also to have things discussed maybe in a more controversial manner. So for me, the greentocracy one is a challenging one, and I know that it's inside the organization raised maybe a little more question marks and discussions than the double positive, the post-Anthropocene, and especially as the kind of doomsday, doom and gloom, Extinction Express one. So the grayish things that don't come natural to your mind. How could that be, that the planet is well off but society isn't? That's an interesting one to chew on. Yeah.
I agree. We have a lot of questions, but we're already running a bit behind time. I do just want to combine a couple for any last thoughts you might have. So there was kind of a couple of questions about how do you make sure the kind of level of time and investment that's required, and also how you ensure comprehensiveness and lack of bias, and when you include experts, or you keep it internal to the organization. What I will just say is if you've got any kind of one thing that stands out or that you want to respond to on any of those points, and then we'll have to move on.
Yeah, we don't, in that particular case with that scenarios, but also with the others, we kind of make a big effort, and a big investment as a firm to do that kind of work. It's costly, it's time consuming, and we always hope that the outcome justifies, the investment that the firm itself is taking. Yeah, this is what we, bring to the table, and what we as an organization, which is a trust on behalf of the employees, invest our own time and money in that type of activities. And it is important, to have conversations and exchange with scientists and with real experts in the field, but we don't overdo it. We trust the members of the organization from the various backgrounds, and it is a super diverse organization that we have, to bring in the perspective and the knowledge and the expertise, and that we, as the ones facilitating the process, enabling the process, creating the atmosphere to, at the same time, let loose while bringing your full knowledge and your full personality to the room, as Chris kind of said it. We trust that we do this well because we're experts in foresight and in scenario management and creation. So there's neither facilitators from external nor too much experts from the various scientific fields or industries that we bring to the table. We trust that we figure it out, but we have to sense check and include the knowledge that is out there. We would be stupid not to do this.
Wonderful. Thanks very much to both you and Chris for sharing your insights. We could go on forever, but we're now going to hear from Quirine. Quirine recently joined Plan as the head of strategy development. Prior to that, Quirine held roles in the social impact and corporate sector, including as a director at Philips in the global strategy team. So I'll hand over to Quirine, but she'll also be joined by follow-on questions by her colleague Hannah, who was also involved in the process about developing these scenarios. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Quirine to start sharing. If you're having problems, I can carry on sharing. I can put the presentation on mine.
I have it on, and can you all hear me as well?
I can see you, yeah, and hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for inviting me to share our experience as well. So as well, what I would like to touch on during this this presentation is we have already spoken a lot about why it is important to actually look into complex potential futures. But now I would also like to share one approach for how this can be done and share an experience from Plan. So that is what I will go to. And just as a little bit of background, I think also Samantha also already nicely described for her scenario planning is really about opening up our minds and disrupting the way we think, which was also really very much reflected in the conversation that we just had. It was also really one of the key reasons why we started to developing different future worlds at Plan about a year ago, because we also really realized by looking at different, we have to look at the external world and not only look at specific trends, but also really look at how do different trends actually interconnect. And we also really realize if you see how do the different trends interconnect, then you really start to think about what are then the implications of that, both for the world as a whole, but then also in our case for Plan ourselves and for the goals we work for and work with.
Quirine, sorry to interrupt quickly. People are having issues with the audio, so could you get a bit closer to your mic, please?
Okay, I will.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
And can everyone see the PowerPoint as well? Because all I can see is your video. So we just need to make sure that we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay. That is a bit weird because I shared my screen. If it is an issue, I'm also happy for you to share the screen, and then I can just tell you when to go to the next slide.
Okay, let me see how. Is everyone seeing the presentation now?
Yes, thanks.
Great.
For me.
Okay. Go ahead, Quirine. And yeah, just close to your mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I will. So if you can go to the third slide now, so to the next one. Yeah, great. So I will talk about why did we decide to actually look into the horizon scanning and the scenarios. So it was really as also very much already reflected in the conversations that we had so far today, to really look how can we actually make our thinking more future-proof and really stimulate our thinking by really understanding how do different trends intersect if you actually combine them and really think about future worlds. And one also, well, actually two important notes around this is one, so this was done last year, so that was done before COVID. And we are actually going through a little bit of a similar exercise to also really look at what are some future worlds now well, with the COVID happening. And another side note is actually, so this was done before I joined, so I haven't been part of the development of these future worlds, but I am very much leading in the process that we are going through now, which really is about the new scenarios now and the new normal after COVID. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is high levels the process that we went through. And here on this slide, we could really go on the process in general, and then I will go into a bit more detail over the next couple of slides. And so the first step was really to assess what the trends are that are most relevant for our organization. And that started by just looking at, okay, what are overall the key important trends that we see. And we did it based on a combination of desk-based research, also of primary research talking to futurists or other external parties, but also really by involving the entire organization. So we also had a couple of crowdsourcing sessions that was open to all plant staff to really get their input as well. And based on that, we then identified the two trends that were of most importance to the organization. Then the second step was then about, for those two trends, what are possible scenarios? What are two scenarios that will then help shape the matrix? And those scenarios are also more to the extreme. And I will go to more detail on the next slide. And then the third step is really about what are then the four different future worlds, and really thinking about what are then the characteristics of each of these future worlds, but then also the threats and opportunities, as well as then the implications for plan. So I will now go through how we actually did it at plan. So as I mentioned, so we had the exercise of really first identifying the key trends overall, and then based on a crowdsourcing exercise, we really came with two key trends that we selected for as basis for our future worlds. And those two were, on the one hand, nationalism, increasing nationalism, and on the other hand, climate change. And why were these two trends perceived as so important? Well, the nationalism, as we have seen in many different countries, both in the developed world as well as in the developing world, the level of nationalism is increasing, and also the expectation that was going to increase even further, whether that was because of economic stagnation, about growing inequality and more diversity. Overall, was a lot of growing from us versus them. So that was really okay. Well, that is one important trend to base our scenarios on. And then the second one was about climate change. And of course, climate change is a big topic and a big threat for the world overall, which was of course also very much reflected in the previous presentation that we had. But also for plan itself, it is very important, as climate change, as we all know, affects the vulnerable communities even more, and hence also the goals that we serve and work for. And that we already see lots of the impact right now, whether it's via droughts or floods. And we only expect that to increase, and with that also just hunger, violence, migration, and other impacts. So that is why we decided to. I see that people are still struggling to hear me. I will just check whether I can do anything else to check whether that is better. Can you hear me now, or? Okay.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Great, great.
Yeah.
Then I'll continue like this. So then the second step, so once we had these two scenarios, or these two trends, then we had to really think to, okay, what are then two scenarios for each of these trends? And then if you can click on the presentation, then we'll get here. So then for the nationalism, we had on the one hand, okay, what if the nationalism is ever increasing, it is only getting worse? And at the other hand, the return of globalization. And for these, and for climate change, it was on the one hand the mass extinction / global disaster, and on the other hand, really about global climate action. So as you can see, we really decided on quite some extremes, and so also not necessarily because this is what we think is the most likely future, but also really to push ourselves in new worlds and think, okay, what would the world be like if we see such extreme changes, and what does it then mean for plan? And then the third step, if you can, then was really about, okay, for how do these trends and these scenarios then interconnect? So here we have 4 different worlds: the change from home, one plan, one world, the ineffective collective, and the selfish act. And on the next slide, I will go into a little bit more detail on them. And so here, as I just mentioned, it's really about for how do we see that these trends are interconnected. So for example, in the world change from home, where we see increasing nationalism, but also have really global climate action, which is on one hand, it feels a little bit of how on one hand we have more nationalism, but on the other hand we really have global action, but it is really driven by more local initiatives. Because even though in this future world, the countries are looking more introspective, they still see climate change as such a big threat that they say, okay, and also for themselves, that they really want to take action, and that action is really taken. But also in this scenario, also see how that the people who actually have the power and the organizations have the power is different from the situation today, with non-state actors much more driving the global collaboration. Then if we take another example of the one plan, one world, that is where we would all like to see it going, in a sense that it is where really the global collaboration is really picking up, and there's really just a common sense of responsibility that we need to address climate change, so that action is taken. And also in this scenario that there is a distribution of power, for example, that had emerging countries are actually getting much more powerful and a much greater say, and also the overall more economic growth and equality. And in this world, you see that that have, for example, the UN or multilateral organizations will have an important role. Then a third future world was the ineffective collective, and that is there we are talking about a world where there is mass distinction, there are increasing number of disasters, of scarcity of resources, and a lot of inequality, and almost let's say it's about too little too late, in a sense of, once it also is already happening, then the world is coming together to try to take action. But in a way that is not as effective as in the previous world. And then the fourth world is the selfish act, and that is where there's also mass extinction, that the humans have destroyed the environment, but as countries are much more inwards looking, there is no so global action towards it, while at the other hand you see a lot of extremism and discrimination that is growing. And if you go to the next slide, then I will also go into a little bit more detail, because once we actually then had the different scenarios defined, then the next step was really about, okay, for what are then some specific opportunities and threats that are related to this new future world. And actually a little bit comparable as to what we heard previously as well. This was not so much with a plan ahead on, but really just looking at the world and what type of things do we see changing in the world. And then only the last step was then about, okay, what does it then actually mean for plan, and what are then implications for plan. And so some examples of opportunities of this world, although for this world it's much easier to actually think about the threats rather than the opportunities. But some opportunities are about that you could see a rise of grassroots and localized initiatives. But also to some extreme cases that, well, if there is so much disruption that can actually in a second order then also actually we reduce inequality, as we also have seen in some historical cases, whether it was after the Second World War or after the plague. But so that are some potential opportunities, but on the other hand, also threats, for example, increase wars and violence, because there is more competition for resources, and also more migration, greater inequality. So there are also this is also really a world where the need for a lot of our of the civil society on the one hand, the role is shrinking, but the need for it is really increasing. And so once we had spoken about, okay, what are the key characteristics of this world, what are some opportunities and some threats, then we also looked at, okay, how is then the power distributed? So what are really the key actors we need to think of, for who can influence decisions or who can make decisions? And in this case, we said, okay, well, it's really the national government on the one hand which will have a key role, but at the other hand, for example, also more, say, traditional and religious leaders. And then the last step was really, okay, well, what does this all mean for Plan as an organization? And also, I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight a couple is, for if you are talking about a future world where there is really increased nationalism and a shrinking role for civil society, then we really need to rethink how do we actually operate in the countries. So do we need to be locally registered in the countries where we are active, or what does it mean for the type of partners we work for in a country? But also another impact is about the humanitarian action, because of a lot of the threats, just the need for humanitarian aid is really increasing. So what does it also mean then for our work to be better prepared for this type of work, and overall the resilience of our work? And just to mention one more example, the digital connectivity part, and that is also especially relevant in this world, also acknowledging that, well, digital is also just one overall trend which is relevant in each of the new worlds. But here we saw also a special implication, just because it is so a national focus, and because there is a shrinking of civil society, it is even more important to connect children and young activists and sponsors across different regions, and help them share experiences and learnings, etc. So that is in a nutshell the approach that we took. And as I mentioned, this was all done actually prior to COVID. And although I think, well, part of it is still very relevant, and now we are thinking through the new scenarios, actually the increased nationalism versus the return of globalization is still one of the trends that we are including, but we are probably going to change the climate action axis. But I would also be just very curious to go to the next slide, and to actually have a short poll to also really check with all of you what you see as the two most important trends affecting the future of our sector, and hence what are then trends where other scenarios could be built on.
Thank you, Corinne. Ryan, could you run the poll, please? So we have some questions in the meantime, Corinne, while everyone's doing the poll. So This is from Irena at Oxfam. Presumably each scenario has different response options for plan, and they can't all be possible at the same time. So how did you choose which scenario you future-proof yourself for? And is it actually even possible to future-proof yourself? We can never be fully proofed for different complex futures. So what value does this process then add?
Yes, and it's also definitely not that we say, okay, well, we actually think that it is, well, the selfish act or one of the other scenarios that it will be the future. I think it's also really just a key benefit of actually going through these scenarios and these future worlds is to really to stimulate thinking and to think for how could the world develop, and then also by looking at new trends or at developments that you see, to really keep track on things for how should we react to it. So rather than being surprised by the future once it happens, be able to more anticipate it.
And from Will at WaterAid, how much interest and traction are they getting within the organisation? Are they discussed at a leadership level, at an executive level, at a board level? And do you revisit them regularly?
So these were developed last year, and also the implications for plan they were discussed in a meeting with the senior leaders. So that they were definitely involved, and right now, so we are really going through a bit of an update of the scenarios to a bit of a similar process, although much faster and quicker. And for that, we are also on the one hand, they have smaller groups with people from across plan to really ensure different perspectives. But then they are again shared with the senior leaders in the organization. But I must also say that just going through this exercise, it indeed doesn't mean automatically that it is lived in the organization, and that it's by definition then important input for the decisions, because which you could also really see when this was discussed in the previous in the previous round, is that for some people and for some senior people it was very easy to engage with and to really think themselves in future worlds, while for other people it is much harder to really be really based in themselves in it, as there's so much focus on the now and what needs to happen now, what do I really need to do different today. But I also see that now, actually because of COVID, there's actually much more interest in this as well. But it's definitely a good question. And I see here's also one comment saying about it is about future savvy rather than future proof, and I think that is a very correct statement.
Yes, and in response to Chris's question about gathering scenarios and sharing them together, that's definitely something that we're really interested in doing. So please do let us know, because we also have these formats to share them. So I know OECD have done one about the future of civic space and digital transformation, and they're keen to work with us to present those to you. So please get in touch with me directly if you have anything like that and you're happy to prepare. We have one really interesting question actually about there seems to be a lot of convergence both in the ARUP ones, your scenarios. I guess this is a general thing that we can talk about, but are we a bit too blinkered to what's going on in our sector, and do we need to open ourselves more to others' points of view and other types of scenario? I don't know if that's something you want to look at. Respond to quickly, Corinne. Did you look at kind of dissenting views or something that was divergent and bring that into the analysis?
So what was actually also quite interesting when looking at the different trends, and so for also when selecting the two key trends between in the end chose, so one and the increased nationalism and the other one the climate change, is that you could actually also see a bit of a difference between responses from the global north versus the south. So I think it is indeed really important to, when you are doing this, to ensure that you get as diverse input as you can get. But at the same time, it is interesting, even though these scenarios that really valid were so totally independent from our groups, that there are some similarities. So there is a question for, and actually coming back to some of the earlier conversations as well, for do we actually need to involve more external people who really bring a totally fresh perspective? But I think that is a great topic for the discussion later on.
Great. I would also like to point to a paper by Oxfam GB on mapping global megatrends, the forces that affect us all. We've also done a podcast on that talks about where there's divergence in some of the external literature as well. So please do go and check that out. We've had the questions. We will be able to share these with everyone who's on the call. I just need to be able to see the results of the poll on these trends.
I can actually see them, so I don't know.
You can see them.
Yeah,
it's only me, I think, because I'm the presenter. So, yes,
I see them as well. And so there's the number one trend with 46%. You see climate change, and I think the second one is increasing inequality and vulnerability. And so I think those are, quickly look at the really quite a bit the top two, and then the third one would be digitalization.
Yeah.
And I think it is actually quite interesting that indeed climate change is still coming up as the key trend. And I think on one hand it also really shows that yes, of course, now just because of COVID, climate change doesn't go away, and it will still have all the impact that we were talking about earlier as well. So I think yes, that is quite interesting. That one is coming up as number one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this balancing between the chronic and the acute with COVID-19 and climate changes, I think, is something that everyone is challenging. Is a challenge to everyone at the moment, and perhaps that's something you can talk about in your groups, and we've asked some of the speakers tomorrow to speak to that a bit. So thanks very much, Quirine, that was great. I'm actually going to assume that you're all back. I dove into a couple. I heard some interesting things around the lack of diversity and starting small, and actually a very interesting point that actually the key populations that we work with are actually much better at living with uncertainty than we are as organisations. But I would really like to go to this kind of first set of people on the left, just for your one highlight in this last round of feedback. So starting with Danny, please.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, we had a great discussion. I think we were all going through in one way or another a strategy process for the organization, and we figured out that the two big challenges are how do we make sure that the strategy is really embedded and reflected locally and throughout the organization, but also how really we spend so much time making sure that our strategies are future-proof and that we develop all these scenarios to make sure that the thinking is imbued into the strategy. But what we should be spending also just as much time is how do we as an organization actually make sure that we adapt the strategy in case there are new disruptions or new issues that we need to respond to. So how do we invest in knowledge and learning and adaptive management to make sure that the strategies we've all just adopted can actually remain relevant as the world changes and the futures change. Then just very, very quick, the points that we need to take into account, trying to demystify Foresight, to an extent. It's a trend analysis is something that a lot of people already do and they don't really realize it. So trying to speak with simple language to try and bring your whole staff with you. Second is the importance of engaging partners and finding cost-effective ways and simple ways to do that so that we don't make sure that our analysis isn't just built from the usual suspects, making sure we listen to others. And finally, how do we share more as a sector also our strategies, and how do we all sometimes try and cram the same space, and actually there's a way to have these conversations, build a similar analysis of what the future looks like, but then each coming in with our own USP and our own added value to try and make sure that we complement each other's efforts. So yes, that's really in a nutshell, to keep it very brief.
Wonderful, thank you. Darren, our extreme owl in New Zealand, are you hanging in there with us?
Yeah, wide awake. It's all good down here.
Great. So insights from your group, please. 3 in the morning.
Yeah, we had an interesting discussion. One of the things that was raised was the importance, if we want to get people to buy into the process, is the importance of building scenarios and building the ideas based around evidence. But the challenge that has in a time where a lot of what people are taking as evidence is coming from a very narrow pool of information, and it came back to that view of quite often we build these scenarios in a way that is through the worldview of our organisational worldview, or even in this sector, our sector worldview, and it doesn't necessarily get challenged enough by other worldviews that are going to shape and form how those scenarios would play out. And so if we're bringing a view that is quite narrow, it's hard to build an evidence base that is robust around that. So yeah, we didn't necessarily come up with an answer on how we would solve that and get those other views in, because there were some contrarian views that we thought we don't actually want at the table because we just really don't like what they say. But that narrowed our thinking and narrowed the evidence base that we're able to bring to things to get the evidence that would be there to get people to buy into it and take away some of that messiness in their mind and take away that thinking that this is all just big picture, nice thinking, but not actually something that is grounded in building an evidence-based scenario moving forward. But we did think that the digital environment created the opportunity to get a lot more feedback and a lot more information in, and for a wider audience to have a role in building the scenarios and getting that earlier buy-in to it. So not sure we came up with a lot of answers, but we did think need for evidence and use digital more.
Lovely, thanks. Maybe you come up with more answers tomorrow. So I'm going to go to Deb, but at the same time, I'm going to run this final poll around the necessary and the messy on this. So Deb, go ahead, please.
Great. Hello. So 3 main points, 2 to bringing people along with us on this journey. We talked about centralized versus inclusive and diverse conversations and how you ensure people in far-flung places feel connected and relevant. And one method is doing story harvesting and finding patterns from the full span where you're operating. And second is making sure to bring people along. So constantly connecting your longer vision and where you are today. To the first part about more manageable interconnected analysis, we talked about the challenge where you could be doing scenarios on everything. And one way to make it more manageable is to be focusing on where your organization can add value, looking at your strengths, and then mapping your strengths against the global trends in order to be stress testing your relevance and adaptive needs.
Great, thanks very much. And Doris?
Yes, so we spoke a little bit that good facilitation is important, where it can help to simplify things. And sometimes maybe we're a bit scared if we frame it as, that big scenario piece, and if at first it might sound like an expert discussion. So having someone who can help you make that leap of faith and just jump into it and see what happens a little bit. Then the second point was around that also then it's good and it helps if you start with people describing their own world, or people actually developing this exercise out of something that they're doing every day anyway, like just monitoring the news, and then if there is something unexpected, describing that, noting that in your own words, and sharing it with others as a starting point. And then thirdly, I think, this stressing also, well, which are the people you actually want to bring along? And of course, the leadership ultimately is important, and the challenge of then really integrating that narrative that you have developed into your organization and make it part of your organization, but that in developing that narrative, actually the people you work with, and for example, as Delphine said from Terre des Hommes, the children, right? And what would that look like through the eyes of children? And that is really important. And that you know, the times where you think you have all the wisdom, you know, just within your own staff, and that only they should express that, should be over. So anyone impacted by the change that you seek, you know, should actually be able to bring their perspective. And sometimes, again, using approaches such as theater and where people can get creative, you know, as part of the process could really be helpful there as well.
Great, thanks. We've just got 2 more groups. Thanks everyone for hanging in there, and we'll just share the poll results. Eric, you next, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, pretty much interesting conversations we had in our group. We started by having the concern of the convergence of thoughts, to be honest. We thought there was kind of an inward looking at the moment, and maybe it would be good to have a broader look at the whole matters and have the insight from externs. The question of the so what was raised by the means of how do we bring the scenarios down to the practical level on the daily business of staff and projects and partners. And there were very good discussions around that question, and we came up with I think one of the Oxfam people said, well, we have basically 3 questions at the moment, and we found them very good. The one is how do we, what kinds of things do we need to let go? What kind of things do we need to conserve? And what kind of things or systemic interventions are needed in order for us to get there? So basically, those were 3 very good questions that were raised. And one of the other things that we thought is how to get the people, how to get the buy-in from people, which we basically asked with, we need to make it more illustrative and create a narrative that is able to get the buy-in of people, not to get the brain plopped out, but big pictures. We need to make it very clear and illustrative to people. So basically that was it from our group.
Lovely, thank you. And last group, Ava?
Yes, so I think we also discussed similar things that the other groups already shared. So one of the important things was involving colleagues and organizations members into discussions. But then also bringing external experts to shed more light on different perspectives. So just to have inside out and outside in perspectives. We also discussed that future scenarios need to be made relevant and constantly adaptable. So the question of agility was also raised to how can we stay agile in responses to changes, but also stay focused on what matters the most. The interplay of mitigation, adaptation, and what we then focus on. If it makes more sense to focus on adaptation than mitigation, or vice versa. And another point that was raised is that the future scenarios often don't really bring per se the ability to impact. So once we have these scenarios, how can we actually impact and change something about them as civil society organizations? And last but not least point that was raised was how do we make the interplay between short, midterm, and long-term scenarios valid? So that was all from our group.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So everyone is seeing that it is necessary or more necessary than before, but everything is as messy as it was. We didn't necessarily promise to make it less messy, but all we can do is carry on the conversations. So please join us at the same time tomorrow, where we'll be hearing from a few more civil society strategists, and we'll be hearing from academia and the public sector via the OECD. A quick ask, please do, if you still can, take 2 seconds to fill in the survey. It would be great to get up to 40 responses. I think we're about at 30 for day 3. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time and your patience in hanging in there, and we will see you again online tomorrow. Thanks for joining. And thank you very much to all of the speakers and all of the facilitators. See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.